In the winter of 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a phase that military historians would later describe as the period of maximum brutality on the Western Front. The great Allied advance that had swept across France in the summer had stalled against the German defensive lines in the autumn, and the Wehrmacht and the SS units attached to it were fighting with the particular ferocity of an army that understood it was fighting on its own territory now, that the war had come home, and that what happened in the territory it still controlled was happening without the restraint, that distance, and the presence of the world's attention might otherwise have imposed. The Alsace region in the winter of 1944 was a place where the war had compressed itself into a geography that both sides understood as critical. It was territory that had changed hands between France and Germany twice in living memory. Territory whose people spoke a language that was neither fully French nor fully German, and that had been caught between two nationalisms for generations without ever fully belonging to either. It was territory that the SS units operating in it regarded with the particular contempt that ideologically formed soldiers reserve for populations they consider insufficiently committed to the cause those soldiers are dying for. Patton's Third Army had been moving through this territory with the speed and the operational aggression that defined it, pushing against German resistance that was organized and determined, and that included SS units whose combat effectiveness was matched by a willingness to operate outside the boundaries that the laws of war had established, and that the Wehrmacht, at its best, had attempted to observe. The report reached Third Army headquarters on a morning in January. It was brought by a liaison officer who had been forward with one of the advancing infantry regiments and who had encountered something that fell outside the categories his training had given him for processing what soldiers encountered in the field. He delivered the report with the particular careful flatness of a man who has decided that the only way to convey what he has seen accurately is to remove from his voice every register that might be mistaken for exaggeration. He said that the regiment had come upon a village in the Alsatian countryside that was no longer a village. He said that what remained was the geometry of a village, the pattern of streets and building lots that indicated where a community had stood, surrounded by the burned and collapsed remnants of the structures that had contained that community. He said that the regiment had initially believed the village to be uninhabited. He said that this belief had been corrected when survivors emerged from the surrounding woodland where they had been living since the event that had destroyed their village. The survivors had been waiting. They had been waiting for months in the cold of the Alsatian winter, in the forest at the edge of what had been their home, waiting for someone to come to whom they could tell what had happened. They had survived by a combination of circumstances that each of them understood as the specific form their survival had taken, while the people around them had not survived, and they carried the weight of that understanding along with everything else they carried in the months they spent in the forest waiting. What they told the regiment's intelligence officer took several hours to record fully. The account that emerged from those hours was specific and detailed in the way that accounts given by people who have had months to go over what happened in their minds are specific and detailed. Every sequence was clear. Every action was described with the precision of witnesses who had watched from the forest and who had committed what they watched to a memory that the months of waiting had not blurred but sharpened. An SS unit had come to the village on a morning in October. The unit was part of a formation that had been operating in the region and that had developed a practice documented in the accounts of multiple villages in the area of treating the civilian population as a resource to be used and a problem to be managed, and, when the management became inconvenient, a problem to be eliminated. The village had been identified through the particular logic of SS intelligence operations in occupied territory as a community that had provided assistance to French resistance elements. The identification may have been accurate. It may not have been. In the operational calculus of the SS unit that acted on it, the distinction did not matter. The unit had assembled the village's population in the main square. This was a procedure that everyone present recognized from the accounts that had circulated through the region about what SS assemblies of this kind meant. The recognition was visible in the faces of the people assembled and was noted by the survivors who watched from the edge of the forest where they had fled when the unit first appeared on the road approaching the village. What happened in the square and in the church and in the houses that were set alight afterward was recorded in the survivors' accounts with a completeness that the intelligence officer who took those accounts said later he had not believed himself capable of recording without stopping. He had recorded it completely because the survivors had told it completely, and because he understood that completeness was what the record required. The report that reached Third Army headquarters contained the essential facts. It contained the number of the dead. It contained the name of the SS unit responsible, identified by the survivors from the markings on the vehicles and the uniforms of the men who had carried out the action. It contained the name of the officer who had commanded the unit on that morning, identified by two survivors who had seen him clearly and who had spent the months since the event ensuring that his face and his name were things they would never forget. Patton read the report. He read it at his desk in the early morning with the focused attention he gave to intelligence that required immediate response. And then he read it again, which was not something he normally did with operational reports. And then he put it down on his desk and was quiet for a moment that his aide, who was present, later described as unlike any other moment of quiet he had observed in 4 years of serving with one of the least quiet men in the United States Army. Then he issued instructions. Some of the instructions were operational, directing units to secure the area around the village and to ensure that the survivors received whatever they needed. Some of the instructions were directed at his judge advocate staff, who were told to open a formal investigation immediately with the full resources of the Third Army's legal apparatus, and to treat the documentation of what had happened in that village as a priority that superseded every other item on their current docket. And some of the instructions were directed at his intelligence staff and at the combat units operating in the sector where the SS officer responsible had last been located. Those instructions were brief and specific and left no ambiguity about what Patton wanted and when he wanted it. He wanted the officer brought to him. The operation that followed took 11 days. It was conducted by elements of the Third Army working with French resistance contacts who had information about the movements of SS units in the region and who had their own reasons for wanting the officer found. The details of those 11 days have been partially reconstructed from operational records and from the accounts of the soldiers involved, and they constitute a story of their own that intersects with the larger story at the point where the officer was finally located, identified, and taken into American custody. He was brought to Third Army headquarters on a morning in late January. He arrived under guard in the uniform he had been wearing when he was taken, which was the uniform of a man who had until very recently been a functioning officer in a functioning military organization, and who had not yet fully processed the implications of his current situation. He was not physically harmed. Patton had been specific about this. The specificity was not humanitarian in its origin. It was operational. Patton wanted the officer intact and functional and capable of understanding what was said to him, because what was going to be said to him required a man who was capable of understanding it. The meeting took place in the room at Third Army headquarters that Patton used for interrogations and for the formal proceedings that the laws of war required when enemy officers were taken into custody. It was a functional room without the qualities that might have suggested to the officer standing in it that what was about to happen was anything other than a military proceeding conducted according to established procedure. Patton entered the room and stood across the table from the SS officer and looked at him for a moment without speaking. The aide who was present said that the silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds, and that in those 10 seconds the SS officer's expression changed in a way that suggested he was beginning to understand that the proceeding he was in was not going to follow the pattern he had prepared himself for. Then Patton spoke. And what he said over the next 20 minutes was remembered by everyone present and recorded by the aide in notes that captured both the content and the quality of what was said, with the care of a man who understood, while it was happening, that he was witnessing something he would want to be able to describe accurately for the rest of his life. He said that he had walked through the village that morning before coming to this room. He said that he had walked through every street and looked at every burned wall and every collapsed roof and every place where the survivors had told him something specific had happened. He said that he had done this not because the intelligence report he had read required walking confirmation, but because he believed that a man in his position had an obligation to see directly what had been done in the territory his army was responsible for, and to carry the weight of that seeing personally rather than administratively. He said that what he had seen that morning was going to stay with him for the rest of his life. He said this not as a rhetorical statement, but as a factual one, in the tone of a man reporting an operational reality. Then he said something that shifted the register of everything that followed. He said that he had been a soldier for 35 years, and that in 35 years he had given orders that had resulted in the deaths of men, and had received orders that had resulted in the deaths of men, and had participated in the full range of what warfare between armed forces produced, and that he had understood all of this as the activity of soldiers operating within a framework that distinguished it from something else, from the thing that had been done in that village on a morning in October. He said that the framework was not a complicated one. He said that it could be stated simply. He said that soldiers fought soldiers. He said that the people who had been assembled in that square and in that church had not been soldiers. He said that the children whose names the survivors had given him one by one had not been soldiers. He said that the framework that distinguished what he had spent 35 years doing from what had been done in that village was the framework that this war, at its most fundamental level, was being fought to defend, and that the man standing across the table from him had not merely violated that framework, but had done so with a deliberateness and a thoroughness that left no category available for what he had done, except the category that the laws of war and the laws of basic human conduct had always reserved for it. He said that the officer across the table from him was going to be tried. He said that the trial was going to be conducted according to the laws of war and according to the standards of evidence and procedure that those laws required, and that every piece of documentation that his judge-advocate staff had compiled and was continuing to compile was going to be presented at that trial with the completeness and the precision that the evidence warranted. He said that the survivors, whose accounts had identified the officer by name and by face, were going to testify, and that their testimony was going to be heard by people with the authority to act on it. He said that he was not telling the officer this as a threat. He said that a threat was a statement about what might happen contingent on a choice, and that what he was describing was not contingent on any choice. It was simply what was going to happen. He was describing it because he believed the officer had a right to know exactly what his situation was, stated without diplomatic softening or procedural obscurity, in the direct language that the situation warranted. Then he said the thing that his aide marked in the notes with a particular emphasis, the thing that everyone present remembered as the center of everything Patton said in that room. He said that the war was going to end. He said that it was going to end soon, and that both of them knew it, and that the ending was not in question. He said that what was in question, what had always been in question, was what the world that came after the ending was going to be built on. He said that this question was what the war was actually being fought to answer, not the operational question of which army controlled which territory, but the foundational question of whether the framework that distinguished soldiers from murderers and warfare from massacre was going to survive the war that had done more to threaten it than any war in human history. He said that the trial that was coming was part of the answer to that question. He said that the documentation his staff was compiling was part of the answer. He said that the survivors who would testify were part of the answer. He said that the specific accountability that the law required for the specific actions that had been taken in that village on that morning in October was part of the answer. He said that he had walked through those ruins that morning because he believed that the answer to that question required people who were willing to see directly what the question was about and to carry that seeing into everything they did afterward. He said that he was one of those people. He said that the institutions being built to answer that question in the years after the war were going to need to be full of people like that, and that whether they would be was not something he could know, but was something he considered worth saying out loud in a room where it was relevant. He said that he was finished. He told the guards to return the officer to custody and to ensure that the judge advocate staff had everything they needed for the proceedings that were coming. Then he left the room. He drove back to the village that afternoon. He went alone, except for his aide and his driver, without the security detail and without the photographers who had documented many of his movements through the campaign. He walked through the ruins again in the winter light and stood for a while in the square where the survivors had told him what had happened. And then he walked to the edge of the village where the forest began and stood there looking at the burned outlines of what had been a community. His aide said later that he stood there for perhaps 15 minutes without speaking, and that when he finally spoke, what he said was very quiet and was not directed at anyone present, but was the kind of statement that people make when they need to say something out loud, and the only audience that matters is themselves. He said that he had not understood before this war the full weight of what it meant to fight for something rather than against something. He said that he had spent his career studying warfare and preparing for warfare and conducting warfare, and that the framework of his professional understanding had always been organized around the opposition, around what was being fought against and how to defeat it. He said that the village behind him and the people who had died in it and the people who had survived it and waited in the cold for someone to come had clarified something for him that 35 years of professional military education had not clarified in the same way. He said that the thing being fought for was not a political arrangement or a territorial boundary or a balance of power, though it included all of those things. He said that the thing being fought for was the framework itself, the distinction between soldiers and civilians, between warfare and massacre, between the activity that he had spent his life engaged in and the thing that had been done in that village. He said that this distinction was not a legal abstraction. He said that it was the foundation of the possibility of civilization, and that a war that ended without that foundation being affirmed and defended and institutionalized in something that would outlast the armies that were affirming, it was a war that had not accomplished what it needed to accomplish, regardless of who controlled what territory, when the shooting stopped. He said that he hoped the people making the decisions about what came after the war understood this. He said that he was not certain they did. Then he got back in the car and drove to his headquarters and dictated his notes for the day and prepared for the operational planning that the next morning required. The SS officer was tried. The documentation was presented. The survivors testified. The proceedings were conducted according to the standards that Patton had described in the room at Third Army headquarters, with the completeness and the precision that the evidence warranted. The outcome was the outcome that the evidence produced. The village was rebuilt after the war. The survivors returned. The community that had been assembled in that square on a morning in October and that had been reduced to the people who had watched from the forest was reconstituted around the people who remained, carrying what they carried, living in the rebuilt houses on the same streets in the same geography, going on in the way that people who have survived things that were designed to prevent them from going on find ways to go on. Patton did not live to see the village rebuilt. He did not live to see the trials concluded or the institutions built that he had described in that room as necessary for the answer to the question the war had been fought to answer. He died in December 1945 in a road accident in Germany, 8 months after the war in Europe ended, before the full architecture of what came after had taken its shape. But what he said in the ruins of that village and in the room at Third Army headquarters was recorded by the aide who was present and preserved in the operational records of the Third Army and in the memories of the people who heard it. And it said something about what the war was being fought for that needed to be said, and that was not said with the same clarity by many of the people who had the platform and the authority to say it. It was the most important statement any Allied general made about what this war was actually being fought for. And it was made in a burned village in Alsace in the winter of 1944 by a man standing in the ruins of the framework he had spent his life defending, looking at what happened when that framework failed, and deciding that what he was looking at required him to say out loud exactly what it meant.